is E&P Reports, a vodcast from editor and publisher. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing. And this episode sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide understand the need to accelerate its growth now. Plus, traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way. IQ Audience Plus is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers media companies to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income now with IQ Audience Plus. Visit townnews.com EP today to learn more. Hi, happy holidays. This is a special edition of E&P Reports. I'm Mike Blinder, publisher of Editor and Publisher magazine. And this is the season to be thankful. And if you happen to own stock in Lee Enterprises, you're likely very thankful today because your stock popped yesterday, still climbing today, because yesterday a headline came out that surprised many of us that Alden Capital is making a play for Lee Enterprises. Lee Enterprises, 77 markets, 26 states. That's a lot of newspaper properties, 350 plus. And the reason it was a surprise to the industry is because the ink is hardly dry on the deal where Alden Capital took over ownership of the Tribune company. You may have seen our September cover where we depicted a vulture in a stack of newspapers and called the article What's Left Behind, because we showed proof that when Alden takes over, there is a newsroom picked clean as part of the way that they, improve the bottom line, also selling off real estate assets and what have you. And it's happening again. So as this news unfolds, I thought it would be a good idea to bring in some industry experts, just some people that have knowledge of the past and present of what this could all mean for not just this industry, but for our democracy in general, for journalism. So we're bringing back Gretchen Peck, the author of our September cover story and our contributing editor here at Editor and Publisher, to help me speak to some experts. Gordon Borrell, we all know Gordon, CEO of Borrell Associates. Rick Edmonds, of course. Rick is with the Poynter Institute, and he's the senior media business analyst. And let's bring in Steve Waldman, president, co-founder at Report for America, founder and chair at Rebuild Local News Coalition, as we just have a roundtable discussion about Alden's play for Lee and what the heck that means for the industry. Why don't we first start off with Gretchen. Gretchen, you've been chasing this story for E&P for a while, staying on top of it, constantly reporting as of this morning. And we're now recording this on a Tuesday right before Thanksgiving in 2021, Tuesday, November 23rd. What is the latest lowdown on what Alden Capital is trying to do? I think just about everybody's read the letter that they sent to Lee, but why don't you just give us the quick overview?
Well, I don't think this news really surprises any of us. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we saw this play out starting in 2020 when they took a 6% stake in Lee Enterprises, kind of, getting their foot in the door there. And we saw that in the case of the Tribune acquisition as well. So we kind of suspected that they had their eye on Lee Enterprises. But I'm curious about the timing of it. The ink has barely dried on the Tribune acquisition back in the summer. And I'm curious to find out what you guys think about sort of the timing of this. Why are they so aggressively going after the Lee Enterprise titles now, just 4 or 5 months after acquiring the Tribune titles?
Especially since they're offering cash, right? That's what I've read. This is a cash deal. Anyone? Rick, what do you think? Why the timing?
Well, no, I agree with that. It's fast. It's faster than I had expected. That like Gretchen, I thought it would probably come to pass in another maybe year or so. I don't know for sure. I mean, of course, with Alden, they rarely say, but they have a pretty established record now of trying to buy what they buy. They may have calculated that this was a a good time to gobble up Lee, but I don't know all the particulars.
Maybe they didn't want to wait for COVID recovery to get too far along.
What do you mean, Steve?
Maybe.
Well, in addition to the underlying problems facing the news industry, of course, they've also faced for the last 2 years the effect of COVID. Mm-hmm. And there's still lingering effects. And so the farther we get away from that, presumably the higher the price that Lee might cost. But I do feel like what happens here, it is interesting to think about it in terms of what it means for Gannett and what it just means for the whole media landscape, 2-3 years down the road. And what I'm really thinking about, this is dovetailing a little bit into the question of antitrust and the Justice Department. That, in effect, if there is basically no regulatory response to Alden acquiring Tribune and no regulatory response to Alden acquiring Lee, then we can assume that it'll keep going on. And Gannett is in its own precarious position. So I don't think it's impossible to imagine that, a year or 2 or 3 down the road, we could be having a conversation about this with Alden and Gannett. So I would actually kind of make the case that we shouldn't accept that as inevitable, and that we should actually be having a conversation about what the Department of Justice should be looking at in terms of Alden and Alden-Lee merger. And specifically what I'm suggesting is that traditionally in the last few decades, the approach of antitrust at the Justice Department in general, not just in media, but in general, has been to focus on price and competition. If you look at the Alden-Lee merger through that lens, I don't know that there's a particularly strong case, for blocking it. Mm-hmm. But there's a school of thought that basically says, yeah, that's been what antitrust has been for the last few decades, but it was really different before that. Like up before the 1980s, antitrust actually looked at a broader range of harms to communities. Mm-hmm. And in all sorts of realms, and that it is already within their statutory authority to look at the harm to the community of a merger or the harm to localism of a merger. Localism, as we know, is a major criteria that the FCC looks at. And there's a hint that the Biden administration antitrust people are trying to chart a different course than the previous 4 decades. The hint is what they did with the book publishers. The fact that when they intervened or they've proposed trying to block the merger of the 2 gigantic book publishers, they didn't make the argument just or primarily on the grounds of price to consumers. They also said it's going to harm authors and it's going to lead to less diversity of voices. Like they really broadened the aperture of what should be considered when you're looking at antitrust. Mm-hmm. And so I look at that and think, well, if you all at the Justice Department are trying to chart a new path and a new philosophy of antitrust, here's an interesting test case for you all. This is where you could make the case that on traditional grounds, you probably, traditional as in the last 40 years, you probably wouldn't block this. But if you're looking at broader harms, there's probably a pretty strong case for investigating this merger.
Stephen, have they, it's an interesting argument. Have they looked at cases related to journalism? So let me word it just a little bit differently. Haven't their cases and community trust always sort of been tied to financial remuneration? So if it hurts book publishers, it really is looking at it from a financial perspective as opposed to community news and information or a journalism perspective.
They've never, as far as I know, at least not in the last 40 years, looked at it from the perspective of a harm to a community.
Yeah.
But that's true for antitrust in general. Like in general, that's just what antitrust has become. As you look at, is this merger going to hurt prices? Is it by taking out are there overlapping markets? Are you removing competitors from a market?
Right.
And that's just the way antitrust has been for quite a while, but it wasn't always that way. And what's interesting about the book publisher thing is that they did look at questions like about the diversity of voices, and they looked at the impact of of the merger on whether authors would lose money because there'd be fewer bidding wars for book advances and things like that. So even though it's not exactly analogous to the economics of local news, the real point is that they broke out of looking at the traditional two factors to look at other factors of harm to other stakeholders.
Hey, can I give you a case in point? I'm sorry. Tracking on what Steve said, the last antitrust intervention I remember is when the Orange County Register was for sale. Mm-hmm. The Los Angeles Times was one of the bidders, and they were disqualified because there's a small overlap in where they advertised and the Register's main area. Kind of an odd ruling in the scheme of things, and that cleared the way actually for Alden to buy. So I agree with you, Steve, and sometimes say the antitrust division is living in the 90s as far as their view of newspapers. A lot has happened since, as we know. But that's an encouraging point that maybe new administration and some reconsideration.
Your argument here then is, correct me if I'm wrong, that by these hedge funds, there's been so many damn vultures out there now and so many covers, and everybody's using that metaphor. The vultures are coming in and they're picking away at the bones of local journalism, leaving these communities barren of what is needed in our constitutional democracy. Steve, is that what you're kind of saying? Then you're saying that the government should be stepping in and not allowing that to happen because these owners don't care about the local communities? Because in the letter that they're sending out, good or bad, right or wrong, they're claiming that the scale is critical for newspapers to ensure, this is word for word from the letter. This is Alden's words. Scale is critical for newspapers to ensure necessary staffing in order to thrive in the challenging environment. So they're claiming that they've got the scale to keep them alive. Can't they just throw that back at the government and say, this is the future of news publishing?
Well, I think a smart antitrust legal crew would look at Alden's track record and see, okay, how'd that work out previously when they had this scale? Is that what happened? Did they use their scale to invest in communities and invest in better journalism? Oh, looks like that's not what actually happened. And you just make you'd make the case based on past Alden behavior. And also, like, in some ways, I don't even know whether I'd argue whether that they care or don't care. It's like, it's just their behavior. It's not even a moral thing. It's just what they do. Mm-hmm. I mean, I do think it's a moral thing, actually, but you don't have to make a moral argument. You can just make the argument that this is what hedge funds do. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is we don't have to accept that as inevitable and unstoppable. Like, it's only unstoppable if we say it's only a matter of the markets. If it's only a matter of markets, then it probably is unstoppable. But given the damage that's happening to democracy and American society and communities, it seems like that's a really strong case for that there's enough public harm going on here that antitrust, that the government should look at it. Now, I don't think, I think that if you had a revitalized antitrust approach, like what I'm talking about, that's still only half the problem. Like, you're still, the reason why Alden exists and the reason why they can buy Lee is that there's no other buyers. There's who else is going to buy these newspapers? And so you have to, I think, in other ways, and there's policy things that I think you could do, strengthen the bottom up type, other types of buyers for newspapers to kind of replant these newspapers into communities. So that, I think, would be the other, if you wanted to have a grand strategy for avoiding these kinds of things, you'd want to be looking at that kind of thing too. But I absolutely think the time has come for us to really look hard at a new way of thinking about antitrust and newspaper consolidation.
All right, well, Gordon, there's four faces above you that are being recorded on the screen. And I know we've got tons of people listening and don't have no idea what's going on the YouTube channel. All four above you have ink in their veins. You know, we're talking about a newspaper-centric. You at Borrell Associates are agnostic to all. I mean, you've got people coming to your conference and who subscribe to reports from other legacy media broadcast. How would they feel if suddenly in a competitive environment, if the government stopped saying newspapers are a business and started saying they're a public trust, they're a necessity in our, and drew the line there? Because that's what you're saying, Steve. You're saying it's not just a business, it's a heritage that must be maintained. So the government has to look at newspapers in a different light. Hold on, Steve, for your response. Gordon, that's not fair play, right? In a local market.
Well, let me correct you.
Yes,
my family goes back to the newspaper business to the late 1800s. My great grandfather was publisher of the Germantown Gazette. I've been a newspaper reporter and editor. I love the newspaper industry. My wife has written for many different publications, so I'm very steeped in it. I'm taking a very different, cold-hearted approach to helping the industry survive, and it ain't looking to the government for antitrust protection and things like that. The last thing you really want is the government involved in running a journalistic organization. I don't like to see Alden come in because I've known what they've done to my newspaper, the Virginian Pilot, where I worked. My wife worked as well. You know, they've decimated it even further. I hate that. I like the path. I want to see newspapers survive, and I want to see it survive without the help of the federal government. If you want the FCC to come in and begin to regulate, better be prepared for what's going to happen. I think that Lee has been on a path to develop probably one of the best newspaper models that will sustain journalism through a series of different types of things, one of which is a very strong focus on digital. So when you look at Alden's approach, Alden is saying Lee's got $350 to $400 million in real assets. Yeah, real property. Let's sell that. You're exactly right. They're going to come in, they're going to sell that. They're going to make a lot of their money back. They're going to rent space, let people work from their homes. They're going to cut. Their profit margins might go into the double digits instead of single digits, which is where Lee is right now. And it's purely financial, riding that sucker into the ground. I don't want to see that. I think that there is a different path, and it's going to require very smart people in the industry, which I actually think Lee has. They're doing some behind the scenes things that are really, really fascinating. They're not in this just to deliver real value to shareholders. That's part of it. They're in it to support journalism. I like that approach far more than going, oh, please help me with antitrust here. Look what's happening. The way that the SEC has looked at things is just to basically say, well, okay, is it a fair business practice? Not does it support community journalism? Does it support communities? So I'm a little more hands-off, laissez-faire than I think some of you may be. And I really do want to see some strong business leaders come in and say, you know what? The news industry is not under duress. It has expanded greatly, and we are going to put money into it to develop and to control and to help the news industry in the local markets, rather than just say, we really need to support journalism and we need to support that newsroom that we've supported the same way, defining news in a very, I'm getting angry, in a very narrow way. I'm building to a crescendo here. No, shut up, 10 seconds. Defining news in a very narrow way that says, here's the story, here's the headline, here's what we say is news. There is a lot more that the community is defining as news, and many, many more opportunities for distribution that not only readers would support, but also viewers and listeners, and most particularly advertisers who want their help telling their own stories. I'm done.
Go ahead. Who was going to jump in there? Was that you, Steve?
Yeah, I would say if Lee is really on a good path, and you know that much better than I do, why shouldn't they fight the acquisition?
Well, because
I'm sure they will. I hope they will.
Is that true? I mean, do you think they will?
I heard from some insiders they're very conflicted because a lot of that stock is their portfolios. I mean, there are a lot of conflicted is the word, right? I mean, I can't get anyone to speak to us about it because they're going, man, I got ink in my veins like Gordon here. We're going to have Gordon prick his finger in Miami at the conference and show that ink coming out. But damn it, I'm going to make a lot of money from this, right? And
yeah, that's the issue. I know not all that well, but I know Kevin Mowbray personally. I've spoken with him a number of times, and I know where his heart is. So it would surprise me that it wouldn't pain him hugely, greatly, that Lee went to Alden under his watch. I know his interest and focus on journalism. I know how proud he is of what they've done in their communities, and they've done some really remarkable things. So it's all about the Benjamins. I'm just so sorry. It really is. And that doesn't bode well for this news.
Well, maybe this broadcast will get some of them to wake up and maybe not. I don't know. I'm sorry. All right. So our best hope. Okay, Steve, I believe in what you said, Steve. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. These guys don't show a massive commitment to growing newsrooms in local towns. They're into slash and burn. Correct, Steve? You have to unmute yourself, but that's pretty much what you're predicting. Gordon, who has ink in his veins, is screaming that there may be hope that they might fight back, but then it's all about the Benjamins. So what's our best hope, Steve? Crystal ball? I mean, wave the magic
I think
wand.
that's almost the very definition of a case where you need to have a discussion about public policy, where you have an
back to public policy,
where you have an instance like this, where I'm just going to, to take what Gordon said, where Lee has made all this progress and it has an owner that really wants to improve local news, but the forces of the market are leading it in a direction that even Lee doesn't necessarily want, and which wouldn't be necessarily good for communities. So I guess the question is, do we just throw up our hands and say, well, nothing can be done, that's the way the market works? Or are there certain instances where that's when society says there are some higher values at stake here that we should be talking about as well? 6
a.m. City would say, how dare you get involved in the playing field here? This is going to give me great opportunity to launch my email only sites in these cities and seize this, tap into. Anybody at Lion would scream at Congress, stay out, stay out, stay out. It's just a business. Mm-hmm. So are we just old?
I don't know about that. I don't know about that, because good. I would, first of all, I would make I agree with what you said, Gordon, about the FCC, but I would make a very big distinction between antitrust and other forms of regulation. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, antitrust was being advocated by Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt because they thought it would make capitalism work better, not because it was a encroachment of socialism. It was that the way you have capitalism work better, including having new players, like the primary victims of when you don't have antitrust, and are startups, are things that don't even exist, that get squeezed out by the power of larger, market dominant companies.
And sometimes the consumer, because they lose access to that innovation, or they pay higher prices. Wasn't Teddy Roosevelt mostly influenced from the fact that there was very little coal in people's homes and they were freezing to death over the winters? And he realized no one cared. So you're back to your point there, Steve. He was really trying to help someone freezing in a building to have.
But it was from a perspective of making capitalism work better. Mm-hmm. It wasn't. Teddy Roosevelt was not a socialist.
We're a bunch of Pollyanna people.
Well, one thing I think that really emboldens the antitrust argument, particularly with the DOJ, is that unfortunately now we have data. We have data that shows what happens to communities, to businesses, to property taxes when a local newspaper folds. That seems to me like, it's sad data to present in this argument, but it certainly is also compelling.
Well, hold on a minute here, because I'm an idealist too, but a couple things to consider. There's no law against hedge funds buying things.
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't really a legal basis for saying, they're bad guys, so we're going to regulate them. That's one. So I think that's a big climb. Regulating hedge funds and their tax status is a good idea for another day. And then I think this goes way back, but I think it's still the case that Alden, assuming it gets Lee, Gannett, it still isn't exactly meet the typical definition of monopolizing or a cartel. They're like Google and Facebook, there's a lot more concentration in various industries where the antitrust standards applied. I may be setting up something you disagree with there, Steve, but.
They're going to be picking up 77 markets in 26 states, 350 weeklies. They're basically going to be just slightly less the size of Gannett. That's the prediction if the sale goes through. So between Gannett and Alden, now you've got your two big guys. If one gobbles up the other, then you've got your trust issues, what you're saying, Rick, right now.
But there are an awful lot of unaffiliated companies out there. You've got Hearst, you've got Advanced Local. And in looking at the industry now, I do look at the national and the local as distinct. That may be a little bit of a hard case to make, because once you put in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post, it's not that concentrated. We have talked about the federal legislation that would subsidize the salaries of local reporters, and that would be a big step.
The Local Journalism Sustainability Act.
Open to the whole crew, to digital startups, newspapers, broadcasts.
Steve, that's your report for America is way all in on that. Basically, there's one leg to the three-legged stool left. Am I right? It's in the Build Back Better. We lost the tax credits for the advertiser. We lost the tax credits for the subscriber. But if it gets through, we still got the tax credits for the guy or gal who hires the journalist, correct?
It's a pretty big deal. Of the three, that's the most direct help to publishers and broadcasters is the payroll tax credit. And even payroll tax credit is a bit of a misnomer that makes it sound like you could get a few $1,000s off your taxes. It's much bigger than that. In the first year, the news organization can get up to $25,000 check, and in years 2 through 5, checks of $15,000 per journalist, per local journalist.
No, that's
really
amazing.
It's quite a significant proposal, and it is in the bill that the House just passed. So it's got a real shot.
We're all in on that. And again, you have your local legislatures coming home, right? Your senators now are the ones you got to hit hard. If they're home, get on the phone and scream at them. Let that survive. Let's get this through. However, if I may go back to Gordon, Mr. Doom and Gloom, the Grinch here, what are the odds, Gordon, in your humble opinion, that suddenly this tax credit's available to Lee? They've got an extra now, a little bit hit, they got better to their bottom line, so we won't be slashing that many journalists. Do you think that's possible, Gordon?
9 to 1. That's my answer. 9 to 1, not.
No, Steve, but the problem is it's an amazing thing to help those families now and those that still have ink in their veins. But I think the main reason for this meeting today, I don't know if it's going to change anything when it comes to these hedge funds. Do you agree, Steve?
Yeah. I honestly don't know. I suspect not, but it is the case because I think their business model has bigger forces to it than would be probably influenced by this. But it is the case that if Alden cuts its staff in half, they're also cutting their benefit from the government in half. They would lose money from that. Now, whether that's enough money to care or to override other, factors that they're weighing, I don't know. it is, in theory, the benefit is only for local journalists, so it creates an incentive
to keep those news stores thriving.
So, but we all know, money's fungible, and it can. They can figure out ways of taking advantage of the benefit without investing in the community, but only up to a certain point. If the benefit is tied to the number of journalists. So
there you go. Thank you all. This has been I want you all to have a relaxing and less stressful holiday if you can. It's interesting news before Thanksgiving. We still have to find many things to be thankful for. I am thankful for you four people for investing the time. Gordon, Steve, Rick, Gretchen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy
Thanks, everybody.
Thanksgiving all.
Happy Thanksgiving.